Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first of several scheduled town halls for the delegation session that's coming up for the House of Delegates. How about if people that are on the call now go ahead and just introduce themselves? I know we have a lot of delegates on the call, and how about if everyone just introduces themselves and says hello and your role in the chapter, perhaps?
I can start. I'm Linda Horn. I'm Chief Delegate for Maryland.
I'm Britta Battle. I'm an alternate delegate.
I'm JD Shepard, alternate delegate and Director of Government Relations and President-elect.
Hi, it's Mike Ukoa. I'm Central District Delegate and APTA Maryland DEI co-chair.
Laura, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Lori Jacobson. I'm the Executive Director for the Maryland chapter.
Thanks. I think that was everyone.
Hey, everyone. This is Kevin Platt, APTA Maryland President, joining by phone while pulled over. So I don't have my video on. Sorry.
And Stephanie, are you still with us?
Yep, I am here. I'm Stephanie Thompson. I am the alternate PTA caucus representative. I am also in the car, so video is not on.
That's great. Technology today is awesome. Is there anyone else on the call who hasn't introduced himself? All right. Well, the focus of tonight's town hall is primarily the impact on the actions of the House will have on the PTA. And there's probably three major things that we would like to share with our PT and PTA community in Maryland tonight. So, Lori, if you could go and advance the slide. So what I would like to do is just kind of start with a very brief history of the PTA, the history of the PTA presence and voting privileges that have been in the House of Representatives with the APTA. As far back as 1949, PTA was first recognized by the APTA as a necessary part of our practice in the role of delivering physical therapy to our patients and clients. So in 1970, the APTA started to recognize the role a little bit more officially in the House of Representatives, and they actually granted PTAs at that time that were members of the House, either delegation representatives or representatives from other chapters, a half vote. So that's where the history of the half vote kind of started. And that half vote kind of stayed in place all the way up through 1998. The dues structure and everything else was kind of established in the early 70s. And next slide there, Lori. In 1998, the House actually rescinded the right for the PTA to vote in the House of Delegates. And if you think back, in 1998, there was also a big push. That was kind of when the Balanced Budget Act and there was a lot going on in healthcare in general. And I've tried to do some research as to the rationale behind this. A lot of this has to do with, there was a big push then to kind of really try to figure out where the PTA and the PTA lie together in our professional organization. There was a strong contingent that felt that the physical therapist being the professional and the part of the PTA practice that had the higher degree really should be making the governance and the practice decisions of the profession. And that the PTA, there was a big kind of, I don't like the term, but the term paraprofessional was started to get bounced around at that time, where the thought was that governance decisions should be made by the physical therapists that were members. And so that was kind of the rationale for my research of leading to the rescinding of the vote. At the chapter level, most chapters still allowed the PTA to participate at the chapter or the component level, but most chapters only allowed a half a vote for the PTA. So that half vote kind of continued. And whenever you look at the voting privileges in our professional organization, you need to keep in mind there's two levels. There's a national level, which is the House of Representatives, and there's the component or the chapter level. And obviously, Maryland is a chapter or a component. So those terms are pretty much used synonymous when we're talking about the states or the District of Columbia. It was I don't think it was anticipated, but there was a large decline in APTA membership from our PTA colleagues as a result of the rescinding of the vote. And there were several surveys and several investigations as to why, and probably the the top two answers that bubbled up were, number one, the cost, which always tends to kind of bubble up in these kind of questions about why PTAs aren't joining APTA. But a substantial amount, 42%, was unhappy with how the APTA rescinded their right to vote, and that kind of led to some decline in membership. And I think that's kind of stayed in place ever since. If you can do the next slide, thanks. In 2005, there was a major push to try and establish a stronger PTA presence in our organization. And that's when the PTA caucus was formed. And that aligned really nicely with the governance. Unfortunately, with the PTA caucus, it didn't result in any change in the voting status, but I do think that it gave the PTAs a much stronger voice in our organization. A little bit of history behind me. I started my career at Anne Arundel Community College as a PTA educator, and I've worked with PTAs my whole career. But when I started working with the college and in our PTA program, is when I really started to focus on the governance side of the PTA, and I've become a pretty big advocate for the role of the PTA, both in practice, in our physical therapy practice, as well as in the APTA. The caucus consists of one PTA member representative from each chapter. So Stephanie has been our PTA caucus representative for quite a while, and I believe Kelly is now taking that role over, if I'm not mistaken. And Kelly is also our delegate to the chapter representing the PTA caucus in Maryland. And correct me if I'm wrong there, Stephanie. That's right.
Nope, you're right, Dave.
Okay, cool. Okay, cool. All right. A huge change happened in 2015, and the House of Representatives at that time voted to allow chapters, i.e. the state of Maryland and other state chapters or components, and sections to revise their bylaws to give the PTA a full vote, full voting rights at the chapter level. So prior to that time, PTAs only had a half vote. I remember going around the room in our chapter meetings, and if a PTA member was there, they had to only stand up and count a half a vote, which was bizarre in my opinion. But anyway, so starting in 2015, at the component level, PTAs were now granted a full voting privilege, and that was a tremendous asset, I think, to our chapter in Maryland for sure, and to the overall function of the PTA and the PTA collaboration that was going on at that time. So today, PTAs do have full voting rights in 45 chapters, and they have full voting rights in up to 50% of our sections and academies. And PTAs also serve on our licensing board across the country. They help interpret and protect the physical therapy practice, particularly at the state level, and also at the PTA caucus. The work of the caucus has really, really benefited our profession tremendously, in my opinion. And I think that has gotten much stronger even since 2015. So better in Maryland, I think it is important to realize that Maryland was one of the very first states to immediately revise our bylaws. And that granted full vote. I remember when that happened at our fall meeting. It's pretty cool. And the PTAs have had a full vote since that. And then at the chapter level, we've also decided to have our PTA caucus delegate and representative very active in the chapter. And I was just talking to Lori before this call, and I think that's even going to expand beyond that with all this happening in the House regarding the PTAs this fall. So next slide. Yay, Maryland. So where do we stand today? As of this point, PTAs cannot serve as component or chapter delegates to the House of Delegates. The PTA caucus does not have voting privileges in the House either. It's interesting because during our live House sessions, usually the PTA caucus members are sitting in the galley, which is in the back of the room. And in the past few meetings that I've been a chapter representative, Stephanie is in the back of the room texting myself and a couple other delegates with recommendations on how the caucus would like us to deliver our vote or to have discussions in the House of Representatives. And I know on a personal level, I was sitting there and I got a text from Stephanie and said, you need to stand up and speak. And I got up and spoke. So that's kind of how this has been played out. And I don't know if that's a very efficient way to run things. And I'm hoping that you'll see some changes that are about to hopefully occur. So where are we now? So the House of Representatives is meeting in person in Washington, D.C. in September, I want to say 10th and 11th. And we have 13 RCs. RCs are basically motions or amendments that are coming before the House. I believe the RC stands for Reference Committee, and then they assign a number to each of the motions or amendments that the House of Delegates will be voting on. So perhaps the biggest lift that the House is going to have this fall is the overall revision of the APTA bylaws. So RC 121 is a huge huge RC before the House. It's got a lot of components to it. And I want to say there's amendments A through H, or roughly that many, that the House will be looking at. And there are basically 3 RCs that are going to impact the PTA. And that's kind of what I wanted to go over tonight. So in the first RC 121, if you think about that's the blanket revision of the overall bylaws of the APTA. They did look at the structure of the membership. They're streamlining the membership of the APTA, and that does affect our PTA members that are in the APTA now. So RC 121 has language in it that, number 1, proposes that PTA members of the APTA are going to be categorized as what we call an engagement group. The engagement group is synonymous with our PTA caucus. So that's not really a big change. The term engagement group is a new term, but it sounds like the caucus wants to continue to use their name and function within that.
Dave, I can clarify that for you if you want me to.
Thank you. Yes, thanks.
So within the documents of the APTA has defined what an engagement group is. So that's the PTA caucus, the student assembly, any of those special groups basically. But the APTA doesn't have a definition for what the PTA caucus is, but we are categorized under the engagement group.
Thank you. Perfect. And in my research into what makes up the engagement group, students are also going to be categorized as members of that engagement group, both PT and PTA students. So the other language that's very clear in RC 121 is the overall adoption of significant language with regard to the component or chapter level. So remember, there's 2 levels of voting privileges for the PTA: national at the House of Delegates and chapter or component level, which for our definitions here is at the state level. So the RC 121 affirms that the PTA has the right to hold an office in the chapter level with a few exceptions. They can't sit for they can't run or sit for any position that is either the president or can lead to the president of the chapter. So that rules out obviously the president-elect, vice president, or chief delegate. So none of those offices can be held by a PTA, therefore they can't run for those offices. However, it is very strong in this language that any mention of the term half vote is now gone. So the PTA will have a full vote in all components, and counting PTA votes as a full vote. So that's a pretty encouraging language there. However, it still enforces that PTAs cannot serve as component delegates. In other words, if we have a PTA in the state of Maryland who wants to serve as one of the state delegates, the RC 121 does not modify that. They still cannot do that. And then finally, in an attempt to add some voting responsibility or some voting privilege to the PTAs, RC 121, and this is a big change, is proposing to grant 5 voting delegates to the House of Delegates, but those, and that would come from the PTA caucus. So the PTA caucus would have 5 delegates that would sit in the House of Delegates with partial voting rights. So the partial voting rights include voting on only national elections. So that consists of the APTA board of directors and the nominating committee. They would not be able to vote on any motions that impact governance or amendments or any motions that would involve changing the practice of physical therapy. So the way I interpret that, RC 121 is a step in the right direction. I think the Maryland chapter feels it does fall a little bit short. So thank you, Lori. To the next slide. So there are now 2 amendments that are looking at modifying RC 121 to further give the PTA a more substantial voting privilege in the House of Delegates. Amendment A, if this passes, what's going to happen is the PTA caucus will be allotted 2 voting delegates, and that's 2 voting delegates with full voting rights. They're not going to be restricted to the national elections or the nominating committee only. While this reduces the number of delegates from 5 to 2, it gives those 2 delegates full voting rights, where the 5 delegates before in RC 121 would only have partial voting rights. So we see this as a very positive move. Where Amendment A falls short is that it still does not allow for PTAs to serve as component or chapter delegates. So I'm very happy to let anyone listening to this know that at our initial delegate meeting that was held 2 nights ago, the Maryland delegation voted to co-sponsor this amendment. That means that we are putting our full voting support behind this amendment, and that's a very good thing. The more RCs that have co-sponsors, the more strength that RC has at the House.
And Dave, to add on to Amendment A, the PTA caucus is strongly in favor of this happening because of last year with sections being granted delegates voting rights. We think this is the step in the right direction of allowing our component as a PTA caucus to have 2 full voting rights. So even though the original amendment is saying 5, we're okay with just 2 for right now because it is a step in the right direction, just like last year's amendment for sections to have a vote.
And Maryland's right behind you, Stephanie, 100%. I totally agree. Amendment B goes a step further, and it's our hope that both Amendment A and B pass, which would be phenomenal. Amendment B goes a step further where it will allow chapters and components, if they choose to revise their bylaws to allow a PTA to serve as a component delegate in the House of Delegates. So it doesn't mandate that. It allows the chapters the right to choose whether or not they would want to do that. So theoretically, what could happen is a PTA could serve as one of Maryland's delegates to the House of Representatives with full voting rights. And once again, at our meeting 2 nights ago, the Maryland delegation voted not only to co-sponsor this amendment, but to also recommend that it go on what's called the consent calendar. The consent calendar, what it tries to do is it tries to take as many motions that are before the House that they are not controversial. We don't expect a whole lot of deliberation on them to be put on a special blanket approval that the House can vote on in a lump, and that will save a lot of time and energy at the House of Representatives. So that's a very good thing. Again, for the PTAs in Maryland, please know the strength and support that you have in your chapter leadership. With Stephanie and Kelly's guidance, I think you guys are in good hands. And I'm super excited about these 2 amendments. It's in my mind a long time coming. And then the final amendment, the final RC before the House is not related to the bylaws changes, but this would be a recommended change to the PT and PTA core values. If you remember, I think it was maybe last year or 2 years ago, the core values for the PT and PTA came together through a House action, which was pretty cool. What this does is adding another core value to the existing ones on inclusion. And I can read this for those of you that are listening, maybe in your car. Inclusion occurs when the PT and PTA create a welcome and equitable environment for all. PTs and PTAs are inclusive when they commit to the production of a safe space, elevating diverse and minority voices, acknowledging personal biases that may impact patient care, and taking the position of anti-discrimination. And all of my continuing education and work that I've been doing in anti-discrimination and anti-racism, anti-discrimination is a very powerful statement. It means that we need to be proactive in eliminating and getting rid of discrimination, not only at a personal level, but at a professional level in all of our policies and procedures, et cetera. So we are full-throated behind this amendment, this RC as well. And again, at our meeting the other night, the Maryland delegation voted to both co-sponsor and recommend this go on the consent calendar. So at this point, if there's any debate or discussion, I'll be quiet and open the floor.
Thank you, Dave, and to Stephanie and to Kelly for getting that information all together, because that's a really great overview. So thank you so much. Hopefully we have some questions.
So some of the things that just came up with concern was like if the House of Delegates number of delegates decreases, because I know that is being talked about, because right now it's currently like 437. If it decreases down to 300, people are worried that how much change is that going to impact if PTAs have full voting rights? So if we get 2 voting delegates and the House number stays at 437, the voting strength of that is 0.46%. If the House changes to 300, the voting strength of the PTA is just 0.59%. So people are worried about if just the PTA caucus is given voting rights, it's going to be a huge impact on the vote at the House. But when you look at the statistics, the strength isn't there. It doesn't change it by a lot. So people should not be worried and people should be supportive about it. And then, sorry, I'm just going through the talking points here real quick. That was really the only thing, is people were worried about allowing the PTA delegate. So if only Amendment A goes through, that was their only worry, was the strength of the vote. And that's why also if we decrease from 5 to 2 right now, it's a little bit less concerning maybe to somebody that's not really thinking about those numbers right now. But that was really mainly it. And then the rest of it was about just really including the PTAs within the profession, since that's not part of the definition right now. So, I mean, it's a big year for the PTAs, and I really am looking forward to seeing the discussion that's going on and seeing the support that takes place. Crossing my fingers that everything goes through the way that we want it. Yeah, I think that's mainly it.
I think we share your sentiments, Stephanie, that we want those amendments to go through, the amendments as opposed to the bylaw change from the special committee.
Yeah.
So we'd like to thank everyone on behalf of the chapter. Thanks to Dave Thomas and Stephanie Thompson for their work in preparing this material. And we'd also like to remind you of 2 upcoming events in August. So on Monday, August 2nd at 6 p.m., we'll have another session which will focus on the motions related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, vulnerable health populations, and any other questions you have or other RCs that you'd like to discuss. We would be happy to help everyone understand those better and accept your feedback and input. And then the second event on August 11th, that's a Wednesday at 7 p.m. We will focus on the topic of promoting physical therapist services for COVID, another motion related to the charge for future specialization and advanced clinical practice in PT, and on productivity standards. So, and again, any other questions you might have. So please join us again, and thank you for viewing this session.